What is up, everybody? Welcome back to this week's episode of Fitness Decoded. I am here with my co-host, David Castro. How you doing, David?
I'm pretty good, man. How are you?
I am excellent. This might be a technically challenged stream, just because the internet and some background noise going on around me might not be ideal for the situation, but we'll see how it goes. Might be a little bit scuffed, but yeah, as the title suggests, today we are getting into talking about exercise prep and exercise recovery. So going into warm up and cool down, basically what's going to go into a good warm up, what kind of things we should be doing, differentiating kind of the different types of warm ups we can be doing, and exactly who should be doing what for each warm up. And same with the cool down, same with the recovery, talking about that post-exercise recovery, how we can recover directly after a workout, and how we can recover even after our cool down is done. When we go home, go to sleep, wake up the next day, we're still in that recovery phase until we go and exercise again. So that's kind of the general consensus of what we're going with today. So we're just going to jump right into it and start talking about the warm-up. So
A quick little note
go for
is
it.
Matt's going to take the lead for this podcast today. I'm going to be kind of serving as the role of an athlete who maybe doesn't quite understand all the science or doesn't really care about it, as any listener to this podcast might not care about the exact reasons why we do things. So I'll be asking questions to try and simplify a lot of the concepts that we're going to explain today and kind of create a little bit more discussion on this episode and moving forward, I guess.
Right. So, yeah, let's get into the warm-up. So, as I'm sure most people who do exercise know, you should always be doing a warm-up before you just jump right into it. You know, you're never going to go to the gym and just jump straight into your straight into your exercise for the day. You've got to warm up. You've got to gently progress your body to be able to get into that state to get your optimal performance out of that. So that's basically the main purpose of the warm-up. It's going to gently prepare your body for exercises by gradually increasing your heart rate, your circulation. It's going to loosen up your joints. It's going to increase blood flow to the muscles. And then obviously, as part of every good warm-up, you've got stretching. I'm going to go over what kind of stretching you should be doing for a warm-up. And it's just kind of like why certain, athletes, certain sports, and types of workouts, what have you, should be doing different kinds of stretching, different kinds of warm-up activities here. Your ideal warm-up, you want to last about 20 to 30 minutes. That's kind of that nice time to ramp up that body. It's going to give your body plenty of time to get ready for that physical activity, but not only just get ready for physical activity, but depending on exactly what you're doing. Like if you're an athlete preparing to go play a sport, it's going to give you time to mentally prepare. Either for the game that's about to happen, or if you are going into a tough workout, it's going to give you time to mentally prepare for that. If you are trying to like PR on a deadlift or something, it's going to give you the confidence and build up that mental capacity to be able to put you in that frame of mind to be able to get those kind of gains. So like I kind of just went over here, I'm going to go up the goals of your warm-up, sort of each thing that you want to hit as part of your warm-up to make sure you are warming up correctly. So the first one is, like I said before, we're increasing that heart rate and that blood pressure. Okay, that's going to increase that circulation, which is going to give us blood to the muscles, going to give us oxygen in that blood to the muscles. We want to increase the tissue temperature, and I'll talk about a little bit about later about why it is important that we want to increase body temperature. But what that basically is going to do is going to help with circulation again. Through vasodilation. What that means is when your blood vessels get warmer, they expand, and that's going to increase blood flow going through those blood vessels, which obviously increase blood flow, increase oxygen, better muscle performance. We want to increase our central nervous system activation. This is very important. Our central nervous system, our CNS, is basically what allows us to work within those neural pathways that is going to allow our body to do what it does and perform maximally. The really big thing when we talk about stretching and warming up is we want to improve our range of motion. Now, essentially what range of motion is basically, I feel it's fairly self-explanatory here, but
Yeah.
if it's not, it's basically just how much you can move a particular muscle within its range of motion. I don't really know how to explain range of motion outside of saying range of motion.
I guess like within its, yeah, I don't think there's like
range of motion just it's very definitive.
Yeah, within its capabilities of where it can move.
Where
you know, if you have like a ball and socket, and it has like if you have if you have a tripod, and you know how you like it can kind of rotate in its space. We want to make sure that our bodies, or for whatever joint, are able to rotate in its full range, specific to the actual sport.
Right. Yeah. So we're increasing our range of motion. We want joint dynamics and tissue density as well. We want to increase our joint lubrication. So again, that's a fairly self-explanatory term. It's basically how smoothly your joints are going to be moving. Nobody wants creaky joints. I'm sure a few people, young and old at this point, can relate to having creaky joints. And then another important thing when I talk about the mental aspect is rehearsing intended movements. So depending on what sport or what activity you are warming up for example, somebody who's planning on lifting that day, if you're planning on doing whatever you're doing for like a squat, you're going to be squatting as part of your warm-up. You're going to be squatting probably with a bar. You might throw a little bit of plates on there just to add a little bit of weight. It's going to be still submaximal. You're not obviously going for a PR straight out of your warm-up. But what this is going to do is it's going to put your body in that frame of mind to be able to perform whatever it is you're trying to ask it to perform. Like for me, as a sprinter's warm-up is literally just sprinting. Like you're doing strides, you're coming out of the blocks, you're doing like quick one, taking a couple steps just out of the blocks just to get warmed up in that fashion. And that's going to mentally prepare you and physically prepare your body for exactly what it is that you are going into.
Another point to add on that is it also lets you know if you are even prepared that day or not.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I train, I'll have a certain rep range or rep target, a certain amount of weight to hit. Sometimes through my warm-ups, I just realize by the time I get to, before maybe I use my working set, I'll probably experiment with the weight for maybe 1 or 2 reps, and I'll probably determine from there, it's like, okay, this is not going to be a good day, or this might be better than I expected.
Right. So let's get into the kind of types of stretching that I was talking about. So the main type of stretch that I think is probably considered the gold standard here for the type of stretching you should be doing in your warm-up is dynamic stretching. Now, essentially what dynamic stretching is, it's kind of using a controlled speed while moving a muscle through its entire range of motion, like we talked about, your range of motion. So, for example, like if I were to take my, this is your GH joint, isn't it? Your glenohumeral, kind of up in there. Or am I thinking something else? Yeah, it's your GH joint. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, around the shoulder, just the overall ball and socket around this area.
So my range of motion for this example would be about here. Now, this is probably not the greatest range of motion. See how like I try to keep my arm straight, and at a certain point it bends because I cannot get this. This is probably an instance of really tight lats. Which I do also want to talk about how we can fix this, because I do have a lot of these issues that I'll be bringing up, but this would be my comfortable range of motion. Dynamic stretching is going to be moving within this range of motion, controlled, and making sure I'm warming up this area. So I'm going to be intentionally using all the muscles around that joint. So basically all the shoulder muscles here for myself. The main difference between dynamic stretching and what they call static stretching, which I want to talk about after this, is you don't hold dynamic stretches. So, for example, a lunge could be considered a dynamic stretch. Going into that lunge, that 90-90 position, coming up, we'd be working our hip flexors, our thigh muscles, and then coming back up, we'd be using our glutes, right? We're dynamically stretching all that muscle group. That's part of that movement. It's functional movement. This is why dynamic stretching is probably the best way to warm up, just because you are moving functionally and you are using a whole lot of different muscle groups that are going to help perform that movement. So
before we continue, I don't know if you wanted to address, I guess, like a common question that people will probably give any trainer or anybody who poses anything different than what's maybe been taught a couple decades ago, as in regards to like, this all sounds kind of complicated. why can't I just stick to like a typical aerobic warm up, or just kind of like walking on the treadmill doing some static stretches?
Right. So the main thing is it's not an effective use of your time in how you can be warming up that body. But just doing a regular aerobic workout is just it's going to raise your heart rate. It's going to raise that blood pressure. You might even get a little bit of increased tissue quality, but you're not working the muscles that you need to be working to be able to maximally perform and get that optimal warm up. So it's ideally, if you can put aerobic an aerobic warm up and dynamic stretching together, I would say that's your ideal workout, because you are getting the best of everything. You are getting that increased cardiovascular response, as well as attending to the muscles that need to be warmed up for whatever it is that we're doing.
I think also another thing to mention is specificity.
Yeah.
You know, why not we save time doing something like a dynamic warm up or some type of like muscle activation that does, just as you said, does the exact same thing, but we're actually also rehearsing the movement patterns which we're going to be doing. If you're just walking, then okay, an aerobic warm up may work.
Yeah.
You know, if in fact even there might be some people might even say like you can still even get some dynamic mobility even for just walking. You know, but I guess the conclusion on that is that's kind of an outdated model. In regards to the aerobic warm up, I know we're going to touch on static stretching a little bit later and how that maybe conflicts with, I guess, newer methodologies of warming up.
Right. So yeah, dynamic stretching is important to, again, increase that range of motion. You are increasing that core temperature and activating that CNS, that central nervous system. And all of this is going to prepare your body for enhanced movement. And the cool thing about dynamic stretching and dynamic flexibility is it can be used as a warm-up, or if you don't have enough time, dynamic flexibility, dynamic stretching can be the workout itself. Like you can do a whole series of lunges and submaximal squats, all that stuff, because they are exercises. It's not stretching in the traditional sense, which is that static stretching. It's dynamic. It flows. It's movement based, which is going to prepare your body for more functional scenarios.
I think something to keep in mind is the way the term you're looking for is we're actually utilizing the musculature. You know, we're actually like doing contractions. We're actually moving.
Yeah.
Instead of simply just passively trying to alter the tissue quality.
Yeah.
Well, if we were just static stretching.
Yeah. So I want to move into the second kind of stretch here that at least should be included in a warm-up. This is probably something that a lot of people do. They're not aware that they are doing it, and it's probably not something that most people should be doing, and that is ballistic stretching. So what ballistic stretching is, it's extending or forcing a part of your body beyond its range of motion. So like I said, my range of motion for my GH joint right here is this. Now, if I were to move it past that, it would probably be like over here somewhere, but obviously that's not natural. If I just naturally move this joint, that's about as far as it goes before I have to start hyperextending. Now what ballistic stretching is, it's done by bouncing and using the momentum to do a hyperextended stretch. So instead of just going up like that, I'd be going and kind of throwing my arm back. Obviously that's a comedified version of exactly what it is, but you see a lot of people do it. If they're bending over to touch their toes, they're kind of bouncing up and down to try and get that extra little bit of mobility, extra little bit of range of motion. That's hyperextended. It's past their normal range of motion. So the problem with this is it hyper stretches the target muscle and it can lead to injuries. That's why it's not really recommended for non-athletes, because if you're not an athlete who specifically needs to be going past their range of motion for their sport, then it's not something that's really necessary for you. Like, for example, like a gymnast, for example, you're going into a split kick, you're going past that normal range of motion, or like an MMA fighter who needs to do a lot of high kicks. Obviously, the leg does not naturally go above one's head. But in this scenario, it's through the force that's applied. You need to prepare your body for something like that. So in this case, ballistic stretching is going to be good for those scenarios. But again, most people are not doing those kinds of explosive, hyperextended motions in their sport, in their workouts. So I would just stray away from ballistic stretching here. Sorry if it was banging above my head. Um,
So I just quickly want to chime in.
Go ahead.
So essentially, the philosophy behind that is during certain sports, you're going to kind of hit these, very specific instances. You're going to hit these hyperextended positions, and just as with any type of movement prep, you're trying to, I guess, prepare. But it seems like the cost to benefit ratio might just not be there unless it's like absolutely mandatory.
Yeah, like unless it's a movement you know is going to be occurring in the future, it's not a movement you need to prepare for, essentially. So yeah, if we're throwing in stretching, which is always something you should be doing as part of your warm up, either dynamic, which I would say is going to be the best optimal way to do it, and if you do fall within that category of an athlete who does need that kind of extra flexibility, ballistic stretching is going to it's going to come in handy. Funnily enough, just this past Sunday, it was obviously really nice out, so I went out and played the first tennis match of the season. I got to the court, and I was just kind of sitting there, waiting for my tennis partner, and I saw this elderly lady, and I guess her husband had just finished playing, I guess their round of tennis for the day, and they were doing their cool down. And the interesting thing that I noticed was she probably was maybe 60 plus in age, and she kind of goes up on the bench, goes into just a seated position, toes out front, stuff like that, and she starts doing a like ballistic hamstring stretches.
Oh man.
And I'm watching this almost horrified that this is what she's doing, and I couldn't believe my eyes. And obviously I'm not gonna be that person who goes up to anybody, like especially like in the gym, be like, hey bro, you're doing that wrong. But I watched and I observed, and I'm like, that can't be good, man. You can't. First of all, ballistic stretching is not a cool down exercise. It's straight up not. And second of all, you're a 60-year-old woman playing tennis. At no point should you be doing ballistic stretches. So I just thought that was,
At least not for the hamstrings. I could possibly think, I'm like, okay, yeah, the shoulder joint might, super like hyperextend above the head or something like that, or like your adductor if you go into like a super deep lunge. But like the hamstrings, they're like you're moving in like the frontal plane, so I'm just kind of like it's side to side. That
yeah.
I'm trying my best. I'm trying to ride out for her. I'm trying to I'm trying to find some rationale.
It was an interesting sight, to say the least. But yeah. At best, just dynamic stretch.
The important question is though, did you win the match?
Oh no, I've me and my friend have been playing tennis every Sunday for the last 3 years or so. And I have not won a single match of tennis. I've won sets, I've won games, I have never won a match.
You're getting there,
I'm getting there. Every year I improve. But
I assume he improves as well, which is why you don't win.
Well, it's not as though we practice, right? We just meet up every week to play a couple sets in a match, and then go home, and then that's the extent of the tennis that we do. So, but he was like, when we started, he had experience in tennis. I had not. It was my first experience in tennis, so he was already better than me when we started. So,
fair enough.
Unless I actually want to put in the effort to actually get better at tennis, I think. Here's the thing. How I win my games is I have the endurance. He does not have the endurance. So he goes up about 4 games. He goes up about 4 games, and then that's when he starts to slow down, and that's when I strike, because I'm still full of energy. I've warmed up.
Basically, the strategy is don't let the deficit get too big to the point you can make the comeback.
Exactly. I always make a comeback, and then it's usually the last 2 games where I end up choking. But
fair enough.
Yeah, that's my athletic endeavors. But moving on here, so obviously we're throwing stretching into our workout. That's incredibly important. One technique that I do want to talk about that I think is really, really good to throw in any warm-up, doesn't matter what sport you do, or it doesn't matter what workout you have planned for the day, is isometric resets. So essentially what isometric means is it's a muscular contraction that basically occurs when a muscle length remains relatively constant as tension is produced. So, for example, during a bicep curl, if you're holding the dumbbell in a constant static position, so like if I'm doing a bicep curl like this, holding it in this, I guess, 90-degree position and letting gravity be the resistance, and I'm resistance again, but I'm not lengthening or shortening that muscle, that would be an isometric contraction. So in my sessions, I like to have my athletes perform a series of active ankle isometrics, as like typically their sport demands having a strong ankle joint stability. So with volleyball players, basketball players, soccer players, anybody who needs that strong ankle joint stability, where their ankle joint is going to be under stress for the duration of their sport, I like to do ankle isometrics. So that's just providing, like, it's fully self-administered. It's literally just providing resistance in like dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and interior rotation and exterior rotation, and just working with all four planes of movement of that ankle joint and making sure that it's stable in all four of those positions. Now, that being said, isometric resets can be done, like I said, with any muscle and for basically any activity. So things like wall sits, bar hangs, planks. Planks are obviously a big one. I do that with my athletes as well. They're all good active isometric exercises to throw into your warm-up.
Something I actually wanted to add on there is, for myself, I got like a couple of tendon and joint injuries going on, and isometrics, when it comes to my own physio stuff, they are the very first thing that are added into my program. One, simply because it in regards to actual injury and healing, from what I understand, they're probably the safest and easiest to apply any type of, like, I guess, progressive overload to allow to promote healing in the tendon or whatever tissue that it is.
Yeah.
Which is funny enough because again, now we're talking about it in regards to a warm-up, so it kind of shows that simple isometric holds, depending, I guess, on what stage or range of motion of the movement is, kind of has a purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any kind of isometric reset is going to be is extremely beneficial, and it doesn't matter especially what it's on. It's just I'm not going to throw in a full body isometric program into a warm-up. I'm just really going to focus on what joints I believe the athlete or the client needs the most stability in, and then from there we can work with that. Which brings me into my next point, in terms of specificity and what some people need, what some people don't need, is corrective exercises, corrective activations. Now, by its simplest definition, a corrective exercise is a movement or an exercise that's chosen to correct a specific dysfunction. So this kind of already gives us a little bit of an insight into how corrective should be used. So, for example, something as just innocent and mundane, but also an everyday thing that we do, is sitting in a chair, can cause just a tremendous amount of hardship on the muscles involved in that movement. So something like, well, we sit in chairs all the time, right? Whether we're at work, we're at school, if you sit at a desk all day, you're going to be sitting for God knows how long. If you're at school, you're sitting at a desk all day again. Even if you're just driving, if you have a long commute, you're driving an hour and a half in your car in that seated position, you are creating that muscular dysfunction between your agonist and your antagonist muscles. So when we're sitting, our hip flexors, so that's going to be the muscles in the front of our hip, practice being short and overactivated, because we are in that seated position. They are kind of squished, if I can sort of visualize it. They're shortened beyond their typical.
I guess what a way to say it is, when you're standing, if you look at the angle between your hip and like your quad or like your femur bone, it will make a straight
right.
line.
So it's like straight
when
line.
You're sitting, when you're sitting, it goes from here to anywhere all the way in here. If you're constantly sitting, you're chronically in this in this range where, if you look at the angle between like both of my hands, it's always shortened.
Yep.
So you're simply just not used to being in this straight position for extended periods of time, which are going to result in a lot of other things kind of going around in other parts of the body.
Right. So while your hip flexors are shortened, every muscle in your body is going to have sort of like an opposite muscle that does the opposite movement. So your hip flexors, it's in the name, they are responsible for flexion of the hip. Now the opposite is going to be extension of the hip, and the muscle that works with that is going to be your glute muscles, your butt muscles, essentially. Now when your hip flexors are overly short and overactivated, that means the opposite muscle, the glutes, are going to be just constantly lengthened. They're going to practice being in that lengthened state, and they're going to be underactivated. So that means you're just going to have really tight hip flexors and really, really weak glutes. And this is where sort of injury and imbalance comes from. Like a lot of hamstring injuries derive from people having really, really strong quads, because people train quads all day, but they'll neglect hamstrings. So you have super, super strong quads and really, really weak hamstrings. Now your quads are going to be producing more force than your hamstrings can necessarily compensate for, and then that's how you end up with a torn hamstring, or any muscle, commonly with your bicep, your tricep, right? Every muscle is going to have an opposite muscle that does an opposite movement. So the purpose of corrective exercises here is like sort of without correction, you'll be overusing your hip flexors, underusing your glutes. This is going to cause excessive strain on your joints, and it can actually set you up for like disc herniation or any other sudden musculoskeletal injuries. Like I said, hamstring injuries, stuff like that, like I said. So what corrective activations are going to do is they're going to help elicit the right muscles to be working at the right time. This is going to make...
I quickly want to jump in there,
yeah,
and kind of say that the body doesn't necessarily, forget how to use certain movement patterns. However, if we come back and we start thinking about our central nervous system again, and our communication between our brain and our actual musculature, what you don't use, you will lose over an extended period of time. If you are constantly in a state where your hips are flexed and your glutes are always lengthened, shortening the glutes are going to become a lot more difficult. Not that you forget how to do it, it's just that your body's natural tendency is going to be, I'm going to use some other type of musculature to try and to compensate. And that's, I guess, kind of like the main point behind all of this.
right.
Like corrective exercises, we're not like correcting something that's broken. We're kind of correcting like movement inadequacy, or just your body just overusing something way too much and underusing something that it shouldn't be. In the case of the glutes, I think they are the most powerful muscle in the body. So not using your glutes is a pretty big problem if you're trying to do any type of hip extension or any type of lower body movement.
Also, for any females in the audience, underutilized glutes gives you a flat butt.
Yeah.
That's how you get a flat butt. So
yeah. For I guess for other people as well, you kind of
regardless, you want
yeah.
muscular glutes. Like they're going to be that muscle that's going to help with extension and all that. So like,
yeah,
I'm just
otherwise,
saying different people might have
low back.
Yeah, different people might have different motivations for doing corrective exercises when glutes are concerned. But yeah, like in this scenario, like I would recommend like hip bridges? Yeah. Hip bridges, or even like a deep lunge that's really going to train that extension of the hip, train those glutes as well. So yeah, corrective exercise is going to be anything that's going to address that muscular imbalance, and really without an assessment from somebody who can spot those muscular imbalances, it might be difficult to kind of figure out what you need. But I would say as a general average, most people are going to have that hip flexor glute imbalance. Like I think the majority, I'm going to say 97% of the population probably
unless you live for deadlifts, not even unless you live for probably like Romanian deadlifts and
unless you spend the majority of your day standing, or you're already doing corrective exercises as part of your regular workout routine, I would say you probably have an imbalance between those two muscles.
Yep.
And that's
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's also like when you like hear a lot about if you're going to the gym and you're trying to program, like if you're pushing, you also want to be pulling, right? So if we're doing, stuff with our pecs in this motion, our pecs, we also want to be training our back, because we do not want our pecs to be overactive and our backs to be underactive. That's how we get this sort of hunchback syndrome, right? which leads me to another thing that probably most people also have this, because we are constantly on our phones in this position, shoulders slumped, shoulders in that anterior rotation. So we are constantly in this tight pec and underactive back muscles. So I would say those are probably the two most major things that in terms of muscular imbalance.
I guess I quickly when it comes to this stuff, you also probably will hear like along with corrective exercises for anybody who has any history, maybe listen to like a physical therapist or trainer or whatever, or just into general fitness. You'll probably also hear the term muscle activation. It's not necessarily the exact same thing because corrective exercise could be discussing fixing a movement pattern, while muscle activation can be simply utilizing a muscle. But they're often used interchangeably, and for the most part, they're probably referring to the same thing.
Oops, I just had myself muted.
I guess before we go, I also had like a little list prepared of probably the most common, I guess, movement inadequacies or muscles that are generally like in a really lengthened state for gen pop people.
Yeah.
We already talked about the glutes because they're always stretched, we're always sitting. Scap retractors or like our scapular, but we're always in this hunched position. The core. Do you wanna touch on that real quick?
So what do you have on the core? Because I don't I mean, I come across like a lot of core issues, but what do you have specifically for that?
I would say due to the fact that, I mean, if we start looking at our issue of type hip flexors, we'll often see the actual spine kind of hyperextended, resulting in the core being stretched, kind of making that issue, I guess, worse. And for the most part, people aren't really challenging their core. And I'm not talking about like crunches or like Russian twists and stuff like that. I'm talking more like just pure like the purpose of the core being keeping the trunk stable.
Right.
For some people, the extent of their core work can literally just be their anti-extension movements, like their deadlifts, RDLs, like squats that train it indirectly. But some individuals, they might, to get to that point, they might require some dedicated core work like a dead bug or a plank to actually learn how to engage the core and keep the spinal column straight for the most part, so it's actually doing its job.
Yeah.
The other one would be the rotator cuff. I guess that's more specifically to our tendency to be very internally rotated, while the ability to externally rotate, bring I guess the hand back towards back behind the head, kind of becomes compromised as well, because we're always in this.
My rotator cuffs need a lot of work.
Yeah.
This is not great.
Yeah.
To be honest with you.
The external rotators so rotator cuff, and then the external rotator of the humerus itself. So same position, just a little bit down here, because of their pecs and lats, and then our serratus anterior, which it's a hard thing to kind of explain, but all you really need to know is what it does is it kind of keeps our shoulder blade from just kind of shooting out all the time and kind of having like that winged appearance, and kind of keeps it pinned to the rib cage.
Yeah.
That's another one, but that's I wouldn't say not as common, but not a massive concern as like the glutes or the core or like the shoulders, simply because those joints are actually the ones that are really involved with a lot of important movements. So if those aren't functioning properly, you're probably going to have some problem, whether you be a gen pop person or an athlete as well, because you have to consider if you don't have something that's functioning properly, something else is going to pick up the slack, which is probably going to result in some type of overuse,
Like, I know for me specifically, something that has always been a huge issue with my imbalances is my serratus anterior. So that sort of coming down this way, right, is something that it's probably the weakest muscle in my entire body. I'll be honest. My serratus has just never been good, but doing corrective exercises. So for me, what really helped my shoulder issues, as well as working on my serratus, was not necessarily like specific exercises, but I started a few years ago. I started rock climbing, and just doing that kind of movement helped sort of correct some of the imbalances that I had. So it's always important to understand what your imbalances are and exactly how to fix them, because that is what leads to injury when you have any kind of, weak muscles, weak imbalance.
Yeah. Something I also wanted to touch on real quick was when we were speaking about, our dynamic stretching, or another term that people will often pop up is dynamic mobility, like flexibility, this and that.
Yeah.
Do you wanna quickly touch on, what does that, is that like a buzzword? What does it actually mean?
Yeah, so when we talk about the difference between mobility and flexibility, because there's a difference. So, simply put, flexibility is essentially what the range of motion that a specific joint or tissue can move through. Whereas mobility kind of refers to our ability to move actively under control and with strength within a given range of motion. So if I had to come up with an example here, actually, do you have any examples? Because I'm trying to rack my brains here.
Let's see. Let's say. Let's say. Oh, let's say somebody who can do a split, or
Right.
the splits, or somebody who can get into like a pretty wide stance squat.
Mm-hmm.
They may have the flexibility, to move at their hip flexors, to move, yeah, well, not hip flexors, but to move at their hip joint,
Yeah.
But let's say we load. In fact, you know what? We probably always knew that one kid in school who probably had like the really weird like ability to hyperextend like some part of their body, like their elbow or something,
Yeah.
or like whatever. If you took that person and if you tried to load that movement, it would be pointless, because they don't have any strength within that range of motion.
Right. They can't. You can be hyperextended, but if you can't actually work within that hyperextension, then you don't have mobility. You have the flexibility because you can put your joint in that scenario, in that situation, but you can't actually do anything with it, and that would refer to more mobility.
Yeah, I guess like something we should probably really emphasize is that the goal is not, with all these things, is not to be as flexible as possible. The goal is to obtain, the level of flexibility needed for your sport and gain strength in that range of motion, or however many range of motion your sport has, in order to prevent, future injury or improve performance over time.
Right.
So that would be my answer for anybody, wondering like what the difference is. Like the simple answer is you want to be mobile, you want to be strong in the range of motion that matter to your sport.
Yeah. Okay.
Something else I also wanted to say is,
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to all this, people are probably listening like, okay, yeah, I got to be mobile, I got to be mobile this way or that way in order for me to be good in my sport. Is there a cutoff, where it's just like, or is the goal to be always as mobile as possible?
Right.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or I was going to honestly answer my own question.
Answer your own question. Go for it.
But I'd say it really just depends on the specifics of your sport.
Mm-hmm.
For general purposes, we can identify some areas of the body that require mobility, but we can also identify other areas of the body that require stability, Areas that are going to require mobility are going to include your ankle. It's not necessarily a ball and socket joint, but it does have a great degree of motion that it can move through that you need for various activities like, jumping, squatting, stuff like that. Your hips, that's a really big ball and socket joint that you need for various like positions that you have to take in whatever sport or whatever endeavor you're doing.
Your knees.
And also actually, no, I'm going to get to that. Those don't require mobility; those require stability.
Right. Sorry.
Yeah,
you're
your
right.
thoracics.
Yeah, I'm just thinking there's literally only like one plane in which your knees should be moving. It really shouldn't be going in the complete opposite strain, because then you've got an LCL or an MCL tear.
Yeah.
Which is not good.
For anybody wondering, after this podcast, Matt's going to give me all the certifications. I've stripped them of all of them just for that one answer.
Yeah.
And then finally, your thoracic spine. When we're talking about your thoracic spine, we have your cervical up here by your neck. We have your lumbar, your final like vertebrae by your lower back. Your thoracic spine kind of sits somewhere in the middle, somewhere around like the shoulder blades. That area of your spine does require a certain amount of mobility, as for a couple of reasons. A big one is it's involved. It becomes involved a lot with the rotator cuff, so it needs a certain amount of movement, and I'll touch on that in a second. But yeah, I think I gave some examples. When it comes to stability, we have pretty much when I look at it, a lot of stuff that doesn't really move, it can move laterally, but it probably doesn't benefit too much from moving in any real direction other than keeping straight. Your knees, I mean, your knees are a hinge joint like your elbow. If let's say this was my knee, you probably wouldn't want your knee bending in this way, bending that way, hyperextending like that as well. That's going to result in a lot of tendons in, Matt said, like MCL, PCL, which are pretty common modalities of injury simply because the knee is not built like that. You know, it's not built to move in too many ranges of motion. Your lumbar spine, this one's contentious. Some people will say, you know, some flexion, some extensions acceptable. That's kind of changing, but for the most part, the general consensus is still that lumbar spine, you know, stability, keeping it straight in like a deadlift. Just general under heavy load is probably best for the actual discs in within the lumbar spine and preventing some, you know, herniations, sciatica, stuff like that. And then your cervical spine by your neck. Also, probably you don't want bending all over the place, considering, you know, it's pretty high up near your head, so that might be a little dangerous, you know. But when we all kind of put it together, we have something called the joint by joint model, where we start at the top, we have stability at the cervical spine, we have mobility at the thoracic spine, then we have stability at the lumbar spine, then we have mobility at the hips, then we have stability at the knees, and then we finish off with stability at the ankles. Mobility at the ankles. And a lot of it just simply has to do with the actual joint type of the structure itself. Yeah.
Right.
So that's, I guess, the philosophy behind all this type of, like, you know, corrective work, because each structure of the body has specific needs and ways that it ideally moves.
For sure. Okay, well, that's essentially what we got for the warm-up. What we're actually going to do for you guys is, after this is done, and once this is up on YouTube, we're actually going to we'll link you guys to a sort of sample template warm-up that we've kind of created that kind of addresses everything that we've talked about so far and includes all these things into that warm-up. So if you are looking for something, so you don't have to go out and research examples of dynamic stretches, examples of isometric resets, examples of muscular corrective activation, stuff like that, we'll kind of condense all that for you, give you examples, and that should be in the link in the description as soon, well, probably not as soon as it goes up, but give it a few days and we'll throw it in there.
It'll be up. It'll
be up. So I think David has it. It's just some
I got a little bit of technical difficulties. In regards to what I've prepared, I haven't prepared any video links or anything. Just some examples and an explanation, a little explanation as to why I included each drill, and simply just you go in there, pick whatever you think is required for yourself, and then experiment. Really, at the end of the day, be your own scientist and see how it goes.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either myself or David. We're both qualified to instruct you on that, at least.
Yeah.
This is kind of more of our wheelhouse and exactly what we actually do. And what we do. We
don't just talk shit on this podcast.
Yeah. So, all right. So that concludes the warm up. So that brings us to the second half of today. We talked about prep. We talked about preparing the body for the workout. You do the workout. We're done the workout now, obviously. We are now in the cool down. We're in the recovery phase. Now, this is, I would say, the cool down is far more important than the warm up. Obviously, you should be doing both still. But if you have to devote more time to one, I would say absolutely devote more time to the cool down. Essentially, what the cool down is going to do for you, it's going to bring that heart rate down. It's going to bring that body temperature down, that blood pressure down. Basically do the opposite of what we said the warm-up is going to do for you. And it's going to be, depending on how you want to structure it, which we'll go into, it's going to be a mix of active recovery. It's going to be a mix of different kinds of stretches. Well, really only, I would say there's really only one kind of stretch that you really should be doing. Actually, that's not true. I lie. Let's just get into it.
I'm about to strip Matt of another certification right there.
Listen. All right. So the one stretch that we left out in the warm-up that some people do as part of their warm-up, but our suggestion is no, it does not belong in a warm-up. I think that's probably the consensus of the majority of fitness professionals is static stretching. Now, static stretching has its uses, don't get me wrong. It's probably the most familiar and sort of time-honored type of stretching. And essentially what static stretching is, it's probably, again, what you're likely most familiar with when we talk about stretching, is it's stretching a muscle near to its furthest point and then just holding it in that position for 15 to 20 seconds. So like you're doing a seated hamstring stretch, you're just sitting on the ground, you're reaching towards your toes, or you're even grabbing your toes and you're just holding that position, right? That is an example of a static stretch. That's gonna, like, again, loosen your hamstring, or doing like pulling your foot to your butt while lying down, it's gonna loosen your quads, stuff like that. That's your static stretch. Now, recent research has shown that static stretching can actually decrease performance. It has no direct long-term harm, but it's been found that this form of stretching can actually temporarily, but also significantly, decrease the muscle's ability to produce force. It's going to give you some kind of decreased muscular strength, and that's going to place the athletes or whoever's doing static stretching joints at risk by decreasing the body's ability to stabilize and control motion. That's why we kind of leave it out of the warm-up, because this is not something that you want to do before you go into an exercise, because you are almost weakening your body at that point. Doing that can like lead to tears and sprains of ligaments and strains of muscles. That's why if we are considering doing static stretching, we want to leave that to the end of the workout and make sure we're doing dynamic stretches as part of the warm-up instead. And the reason, actually, I didn't really talk about it too much, but the reason why dynamic is really just better overall, apart from everything we've already talked about when we talk about differences to static stretching, is dynamic stretching has actually been shown to significantly increase the ability of a muscle to produce force. That's going to have huge implications for athletes, as dynamic stretching can improve muscular performance throughout a muscle's entire range of motion, and that's going to sort of protect the body's joints during activity. It's going to prevent injuries that would otherwise have occurred following a standard static stretching routine. And these are typically the effects people are looking for when employing a stretching program. They want better performance, not worse performance. That being said, though, static stretching has its place, and there is a time and a place to do it. Let's see here. So basically, yeah. So like really the main things that people say when they're doing static stretching is, yeah, the muscles feel way looser and I'm able to achieve the range of motion I need to play my sport, perform the activity that I wouldn't have been able to do if I stretch. Now, first thing we want to talk about, though, is what is that muscle tightness? David, do you want to go into specifically what
Sure.
muscle tightness is?
So there's two aspects of it. One, I'll first talk about something called neural tone, and then I'll talk about the actual, like, what physically static stretching does to the actual muscle to release that tone. So first things first, when we refer to tightness, like I said, it's something called neural tone. So it's kind of a brain thing rather than a actual physiological structure, like the ability of the nervous system to communicate with the muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what tone is it's the firing of the electrical signals from the brain through the central nervous system to the actual muscle to get the muscles to contract. That's what tone is. A tight muscle is essentially receiving way too many signals from the brain, and to the point where it's I would say, I don't want to say it's concentrically contracted, but it definitely is shortened to the point where it's kind of restricting movement, simply because the brain is receiving way too many signals. When it comes to why it's sending too many signals, it's kind of a multifactorial thing. When we look at an example of somebody who's sitting down in constantly a state of hip flexion, with their hips raised up, we could say, well, because the brain or the body is adjusted to this position, it's the natural, you would say the nervous system probably also becomes accustomed to that area having a lot of neural tone or just being always shortened. So does static stretching address this tightness? Yeah, it does, but so does our dynamic stretching as well.
Yeah.
The only thing is our static stretching will come with, the aforementioned negatives of decreased muscle strength, decreased overall performance, No real benefit or like evidence shown that it actually reduces injury. Even though some top strength coaches will still do it, they might just the simple truth is they're just not up to the times.
So then, what is the point of static stretching? Is it completely useless?
Not necessarily, if we use it correctly. If we place it, let's say, at the beginning or right before our actual performance, it's definitely going to negatively affect it.
Mm-hmm.
Is this actually has to do with our next topic that we're going to talk about, like which is foam rolling or self myofascial release. If we play static stretching after some type of foam rolling before dynamic movement, before activations, and before actual movement prep or neural excitation or whatever we decide to do, all these things will combat that decrease that decrease in neural tone as a result of stretching, resulting in actual better performance.
Right.
Ideally, we don't do the static stretching at all, but if you are somebody who's very stubborn and you wholeheartedly, anecdotally, whatever believe, I can't really disagree with you as if I was your strength coach, then we could do things to combat that decreased neural tone. And before we I quickly want to touch on why that neural tone actually decreases as a result of stretching. Like I said, it's a brain thing. It's an overfiring of those muscles, or sorry, those, I guess. I want to make this as simple as I can make it so it doesn't too complicated. Essentially, in all our muscles, we have something called GTOs, or Golgi tendon organs, and they're these little structures that or muscle spindles, may I say, that, how would I say this? They kind of surround the neurological, I guess, structures within a muscle, and what their role is to prevent a muscle from overstretching by essentially contracting immediately. So let's say you kick over your head, as high as you can. Your probably initial reaction from your hamstring is to get pulled right back. These little structures, that's their job. They're trying to prevent you from getting too hurt from overstretching. And they function with the nervous system to do that, because the nervous system knows, like, hey, this is a bad thing. We probably shouldn't be doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Our static stretching, what that does is it releases, or actually our static and our dynamic stretching will minimize the muscle spindles like effects. Basically, it makes it less triggerable, and it makes it feel like, okay, this range of motion is a lot more comfortable. We can do this. We're not going to get hurt. We do that, which is a good thing, because if we reduce, the muscle spindles effect on that range of motion, it may allow us to get the range of motion that we desire. However, we also want to think about the muscle as an elastic band that requires tension to a certain extent to move. If we overstretch it, like with static stretching, at least for our specific sport, it loses that tension, and it makes it much more difficult for it to actually respond to the stress we're putting on it and produce the force necessary. Our dynamic stretching reduces some of that neural tone, reduces some of the effect of the Golgi tendon organ or these muscle spindle, but not to the extent where we lose that tightness and that potential force production that we need.
Right.
That's kind of the scientific explanation as to why we don't do static stretching before our training. We're basically limiting our body's like neurological abilities to snap back into the positions that we need. An example would be, and you're in the bottom of a deep squat, you kind of want that stretch reflex at the bottom. If you stretch your ankles like in dorsiflexion and overstretch your calves to the point where you kind of lose some that stiffness, not only do you probably don't get that same pop out of the hole, but you also probably expose yourself to maybe an increased chance of injury. Don't it's not clear on that, but just know static stretching is just not going to enhance your performance if you do it before, unless you have done your dynamic and your muscle activation to kind of get that stiffness a little bit back.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So
that's pretty much why we do that. And I think you wanted to get into the next topic. I think I mentioned a little bit a while ago.
So actually, even before we get into that, we've got another type of stretching that we can work into our recovery phase. This is definitely my favorite type of stretch to both administer and receive. because it is a sort of it's a partner assisted stretch. There are ways to do it without a partner. You can just use like a resistance band or like a rope or something, but it's easiest done with a partner. In this case, it's usually done, your trainer is doing it with you or your coach is doing it with you, and that is proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, or
Big
PNF.
words, big words.
Yes, PNF for short. It's a more advanced form of flexibility training, and that's going to involve both the stretching and contracting of the muscle group being targeted. And PNF stretching is one of the most effective forms of stretching for improving flexibility and increasing range of motion. And like I said, they're usually performed with a partner, and they involve both passive and active, so your concentric and your isometric muscle actions. And actually, as I found out while I was doing a little bit of research for this podcast, there's actually 3 techniques for PNF stretching. I was only aware of the first one and only ever performed the first one, but there's actually 2 more. So let's get into this. I want to use just a PNF hamstring stretch as an example when I kind of go over exactly how these are performed. So the first technique when we talk about PNF stretching is called hold relax. So basically, this is involving putting a muscle in a passive stretch. So in this scenario, whoever is receiving the stretch, so your athlete, your client, whoever, is going to be in a supine position, so on their back, and we're going to be taking this leg, because this is a hamstring stretch, and we're going to be moving the fully extended leg towards them, essentially towards their head. So we're basically taking their leg and we're throwing it up in the air, keeping that extension, keeping that knee straight. And essentially what we're doing from here is we're just holding it in a position that is outside of its comfortable range of motion. So like you would almost hold a static stretch, where it's just past that point where like you wouldn't normally hold it there, but you can still get it there. It's still within that range of motion. From that point, what the subject or client or whoever you're doing this on is going to do is you are going to contract that muscle isometrically against resistance. So whoever is holding your leg in this position is going to provide just basically a brick wall of force. They're not going to push it farther. They're just going to provide resistance, and you're going to provide resistance back. If you're doing this with a band, you can do it with a band, although it is much easier to adjust resistance with a partner because it's an actual person with actual muscles instead of just trying to fight yourself. That being said, though, you're holding that isometric contraction for about 6 to 10 seconds. After that isometric contraction is done, essentially what is happening is you are then relaxing the muscle. So the muscle is no longer being contracted, and it's going to be stretched past its normal range of motion into a stretch that's deeper than the first. So whoever's doing this for you is going to hold it for that 6 to 10 seconds, and then you're going to relax, and they're going to push your leg even further into that stretch. They're going to hold that for about 30 seconds. Every time I've done this and had it done to me, like it's a dramatic difference. You feel fantastic afterwards. Sometimes it's not always pleasant, especially in that third phase of the hold relax technique. You are being pushed into far past that range of motion that you're normally comfortable with. Moving on to the second technique.
I actually wanted to quickly jump in.
Yeah.
You know, that's actually something I do for some rehab exercises for my lower body as well. You know, I'll do it with the band. And the one thing I will say though is if you do it, after a while, after a couple repetitions or holds for a couple seconds, you do feel like the blood starts pooling down in your lower body. You start losing a little bit of feeling.
Yeah. So talking about the second technique is called contract relax. This is almost identical to the first one, hold relax, except instead of performing an isometric contraction during that second phase, so instead of providing that resistance for the athlete, if this is my leg, this is me as a coach, I'm providing that isometric contraction. Essentially what's happening, instead of holding that for 6 to 10 seconds, I'm having the athlete then lower their leg, so they are going to be contracting that hamstring at that point to lower their leg down towards the floor, and I'm going to be providing resistance as they do it, but I'm not going to be making sure that they can't in an isometric way. It's just going to be a concentric contraction against resistance, and then again we go back into the range of motion stretch. Essentially, you're just replacing that second one with, instead of a isometric resistance, you're providing concentric resistance. moving to the third one, if this is making any sense at all, again, if you are confused, just honestly look up PNF stretches, because it is kind of hard to explain without demonstrating. We've got our hold, relax, contract, which is basically a mix of the first two. So instead of contracting isometrically like we did in that first one, instead of relaxing into the stretch afterwards, like, so we go up, we hold isometrically, and then we get pushed even further. Instead of relaxing into that deeper push, you're basically actively pushing, trying to get your hamstring even further up, even further, while whoever is coaching you is also providing assistance, not resistance, assistance. And yeah, so in context of the hamstring, the athlete would just raise the leg further while the partner pushes in the same direction. All of these are going to dramatically increase that flexibility, increase that range of motion. It's not something that is going to be obviously a permanent fix, as you know, increasing that flexibility and mobility is something that you do with exercise and happens over time. But if we are talking about recovery and working with tight muscles, if you've got a partner who knows what they're doing, so ideally, you know, personal trainer, coach, whoever, who can appropriately administer this type of stretching, this is definitely my favorite technique for relieving that muscle tension, relieving that muscle tightness, and kind of just doing recovery stretching. I would say even better than static stretching in this regard.
I quickly wanted to add there. We also, just in regards to this whole conversation,
Mm-hmm.
we always have to take it into a context that we're doing these things because as the coach or whoever is working with the athlete, we've already predetermined that those ranges of motion are going to be involved at some point, now or later within their sport or within their season.
Right.
So the goal is to make sure, you know, with the beginning of our PNF, we've gained some extra flexibility. Now we can safely get stronger, you know, without like excessive loads or tolerance or volume. It's safe to get stronger in those ranges of motion, which might translate into better strength somewhere else.
Yep.
You know, for if I was going to translate that hamstring stretch, or which whatever, I guess the first two that we discussed, if let's say somebody, I don't know, let's say somebody who just wants better range of motion for the Romanian deadlift.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the most difficult aspect of the Romanian deadlift is in that fully hip flex position where you feel that deep stretch in the hamstrings. Maybe you feel like you're not contracting, you're not getting a deep enough stretch, or not contracting as much muscle or muscle fibers as you could be to get the most growth for your hamstrings, the most strength in that specific position.
Right.
You know, you might use this type of flexibility training to safely overload that position, you know. Or if you're, for the most part, a lot of the times, I do this, if you're just hurt, you know, if you're hurt and you're trying to get back into your activity, if you have somebody, you know, who you can trust to perform this, or if you have a band or something, you know, with the advice of a physiotherapist, you can start getting back to your regular activity and, you know, start progressively overloading the fibers and the stuff that you need to just do what you need to do, because that's the range of motion you've already identified that you're going to be working in anyways.
Right. And then, so moving past PNF here, there's another technique that I want to talk about. It's called active isolated stretching, or AIS. It's developed by a guy named Aaron Mattis. And he's probably been developing this technique for the last 40 years or so. So it is a fairly commonplace technique, and most people seem to agree that it's the way to go if we're talking about active isolated stretches. So it's basically got four principles. So you want to isolate the target muscle you want to stretch. You want to repeat the stretch around 8 to 10 times, but you're only holding the stretch for 2 seconds, no more than 2 seconds, before you release the stretch. And you want to exhale during the stretch and inhale during the release. Now, essentially how active isolated stretching works is you're contracting the opposing muscles to perform the stretch. So like we talked about how each muscle has an opposite muscle that does the opposite motion, you're basically contracting whatever muscle is going to be doing the opposite of the muscle you want to stretch. So that's going to send signals to the brain. It's going to relax the other muscle, so the one you're trying to stretch, which provides an ideal situation to begin stretching it. That's how we isolate that muscle to stretch. And by doing this stretch so frequently, that 8 to 10 times, we're increasing the blood flow and nutrients to the area, and that's going to give the muscle the ability to recover more quickly. The reason we only hold the stretch for 2 seconds is it keeps what's called the myotatic stretch reflex from activating, which is basically what David touched upon when we talked about like the overextension. That myotatic stretch reflex is basically when you go into a stretch, it's that reflex that your body sends out and says, hey, you're going too far into the stretch, you need to pull back, and it's automatically making your muscles pull back into that stretch. If you're only doing that for 2 seconds, it does not give enough time for that stretch reflex to activate, so you are able to get into that position without it saying you need to pull back. So it's going to basically, as an added bonus, also just increase your range of motion, as many stretches are going to do. So, like, for example, if we want to isolate the tricep as a stretch, we want to be contracting the bicep, right? Contract the bicep. Now we've isolated the tricep. Now we can go into our tricep stretch, hold 1, 2, breathing, coming out. This basically works for any muscle that has an agonist or an antagonist to whatever movement you're trying to do. So, like, example, you've got quad, hamstring, back, chest, bicep, tricep.
I'm trying to think. Like the main examples that I can think of is if we do, that supine position, we're on our back, we flex one leg as high as you can. You're flexing your hip flexor hard. That hamstring will stretch. An easy one is with your calves. When you press your toes into the floor, you're stretching. In fact, people probably don't realize you have muscles on the front of your leg. Those being your tibialis. When you plantar flex or you flex your calf, that becomes stretched. And when you flex your toe towards your shin, that muscle will contract and the calf stretches.
Right. Yeah. So it's essentially literally just the principle of using one muscle to stretch the opposite muscle, which seems pretty straightforward because it is pretty straightforward and is one of these techniques that's been so well developed and is commonplace in most stretching techniques. The reason why we do the controlled breathing is it's going to increase oxygen to the muscles, which is going to lessen that buildup of lactic acid, which is going to contribute to that muscle soreness that you'll feel. It's also, lactic acid can be a contributor to injuries as well. And because AIS is what is called active stretching, meaning the person is stretching with their own body parts rather than using any kind of assistance, it's going to cause reciprocal inhibition. Now, what that means is that when one muscle contracts, another one relaxes, and that's the perfect time to begin stretching the muscle to achieve optimal flexibility. You have anything to add to that before I move on here?
I think this is like, because I've understood this principle, I've heard it before, but I haven't heard like the actual term. When you even think about it, this form of stretching is just very applicable to the exercises we perform. If you perform a bicep curl, your tricep is going to be stretched to a certain extent. Even the amount of time that we hold it for. A normal repetition of a curl is probably maybe like 3, 4, 5 seconds, and it kind of like aligns with the theory here, which is why I'm like, oh, this is why this theory is so pervasive, because it kind of you are contracting something submaximally, like you would, or like during an actual exercise. When you're actually training, you're essentially doing the same thing to a certain extent,
Yeah.
Which is why this makes sense, if we're doing this with very low loads outside of our actual training, it would facilitate recovery because, we're contracting a muscle, we're getting some nutrients, we're stretching the other one, and we're basically working both within their full range of motion. Yeah, makes sense.
Cool. All right, so another technique I want to get in here too, which is going to be a big one when we talk about post-exercise recovery, is going to be our self-myofascial release, or our SMR. So it's a method of self-massage, and it's going to relieve muscle and joint pain. Now, the myofascial, so I'll talk about what fascia is. So basically, fascia is like a thin casing of connective tissue that kind of surrounds and holds every organ, blood vessel, bone, nerve fiber, and muscle in place. Like it's almost like a net that kind of just surrounds everything, that just kind of keeps it where it's supposed to be. Now this
You know
tissue,
those like really like transparent thin sushi rolls?
yeah, that's what I was thinking about when I said that. Like something like
That's
that,
literally
like
that,
that rice the organic rice paper of your body, essentially.
pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the tissue does more than just provide internal structure. Fascia has nerves that make it almost as sensitive as skin, and when stressed, it starts to like just tighten up. And it's designed to stretch as you move, but there are certain things that can cause fascia to start to thicken and become sticky and get into that just state. I'm not sure if it really does do that physically, but that is the best way to visualize it. So when it dries up and it tightens around our muscles, it's going to limit mobility because again, you think of it as like that thin layer that's connected to the muscles. If the fascia is tight, mobility of the muscle is going to be not as good as if the fascia was loose, if that makes any sense. And when it does tighten around the muscles, it can create painful knots. When people say, "Oh, like I have a knot," that's because your fascia in that area is tight, and it's thick, it's sticky, it's not how it's supposed to be. So by administering SMR techniques, we can actually smooth that fascia back out. Like think of like you're rolling dough essentially. You're rolling that fascia back out, and that's going to be able to recover our mobility and our flexibility, as well as potentially relieve some pain that can be caused from that tight fascia. So when we talk about SMR foundations are self myofascial release, also known as, and the most common tool used for is, where did I put it? Is the foam roller. So
Let's see if I got mine too. Hold up.
yep. So this guy
Yes,
here,
sir. We got
nice.
our Amazon Basics foam roller over here as well.
All right. Okay, so, and as you can see, there's a difference between my foam roller and David's foam roller. So, again, this being the most common tool to be able to apply SMR, many people probably own one of these. I'm sure most people have either been told to get a foam roller or probably have a foam roller, but they might not necessarily understand exactly how to use one of these effectively. Now, foam rollers, as you can see, can vary in size and density, but they're all typically used for the same. Like for mine, I can use this rough trigger point exterior, or it's a 2-in-1. So boop, pull it out. Now I have a nice little small foam one that I can use if I don't want too much pressure and if I don't want these ridges that are on it. But yeah, for the most part, they're all going to be used the same. It's just depending on how intense you want the experience to be, really. But
You can also use a tennis ball if you want like very small
yep.
areas, maybe like your tricep or areas like your pec and stuff, where it
So
gets really awkward to lie on the floor and try to maneuver like that.
yeah, so I'll get into that actually in a bit as a different way to do SMR here. But for when we're talking about foam rollers, we want to make sure that we're getting every part of the muscle. There's actually a lot of debate whether or not foam rolling. It's like when I was taught with like foam rolling and SMR, I was taught to go from distal to proximal. So that's basically going from the top of the muscle to the bottom of the muscle. Um,
I guess like another way is just the furthest part of your limb to more to where it attaches to your body.
Basically, so like if we talk
Yeah.
about like if we want to roll out our quads, that's going to be going from our hip down to our knee, essentially.
Didn't you say distal to proximal or proximal to distal?
It's distal to proximal.
Distal
Oh
to proximal.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Sorry. So it's going to be
Yeah,
going
yeah,
from
yeah.
our knee to our hip. That's my bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, knee to our hip. So typically, if you are like lying on the floor, it's going to be going from like a bottom to top approach. So starting at the feet, starting at the ankles, and moving your way up the body. There's a lot of debate whether or not that's actually effective. Really, big people are saying that because it's like when we talk about it's like smoothing out the muscle and the way that the muscle fibers are going, we want to be making the muscle fibers longer rather than shorter. But again, it's debatable whether or not that's actually it actually matters. But regardless, you want to be addressing every part of that muscle. In my experience, I prefer to go distal to proximal. I just think it feels better to do so. So if we're starting from the distal end of the muscle, we want to slowly just roll like 1 to 2 millimeters at a time. Like we're doing very slow little movements on that roller because we want to make sure we want to get every part of that muscle. And we want to make sure we're obviously breathing throughout. That's the important thing. I see a lot of people when they're foam rolling, because it's not always a comfortable experience, they just hold their breath and you're just like powering through it. But making sure that you're breathing, you're getting that oxygen flowing through your body, that's going to be extremely important. Now, when you come across the knot that we talked about, a lot of people, like, you'll know it when you find it. It's going to be that just really stiff spot in that muscle. It's typically probably not going to feel great when you roll over it. Like, people say, oh, how will I know if there's a knot? Trust me,
You'll know.
You'll know. When you find it, you'll know.
Yeah.
It's like you'll know when you feel it.
Yeah.
When
sometimes it's a muscle, sometimes it's actually around like the tendon, but you'll find it.
when you do come across that knot, don't be afraid to sit on it. Just apply
Literally.
just direct pressure for like 30 to 90 seconds and just slowly dig into it until you start to feel that tension release. That's going to be like the beneficial aspect of doing this SMR, is coming across that really tight bundle of fascia and just smoothing it out. Now, like David talked about before, or actually before we actually go into that, another technique I find effective when I am foam rolling is when you find that knot, sit on that knot, and then from there, flex and extend that muscle. So for example, if we're rolling out of our quads, we find the knot on our quads and we're just sitting there. At that point, we're just going to bring our knee or our ankle, our heel, to our butt and then down to the floor and just work within that range of motion. So that's going to apply pressure to it, and then it's actually going to lengthen and shorten the muscle on our foam roller, which is going to help dig in even further. One thing you also want to be kind of doing when you are rolling is not just going up and down the muscle, but also going cross-sectional. So going cross-sectional. So if, like, let's say we're rolling out our calves, for example, we don't want to be just going across the bottom. We want to also be what I call rocking the boat. That's the term that I use. You're just kind of rocking back and forth. You're getting that cross-sectional rolling going on, and that's going to make sure you're addressing every single part of that muscle, not just the fibers that are going distally to proximally.
So essentially not just up and down, but side to side, and also probably, if you have like a small enough implement, diagonally. Just
up, down, side.
As many ways as you can to hit those fibers from different angles.
Twist it, pull it,
twist it.
Do what you got to do.
Literally.
So foam rollers are great for targeting larger muscle groups. So like your hamstrings, your quads, lower back, upper back, anything that's going to be big, and you need a way to kind of target all of those muscle groups. But when I'm trying to target a more specific location, I use a massage ball instead. So one of these guys is actually a lacrosse ball, but it's just a dense rubber ball. As long as you have anything that's similar to this, it's going to be fine. So, like, you'll see some massage balls have like those little spiky things on them. Those are cool too. But personally, I just prefer to just use a lacrosse ball. I feel that's always good for me. I don't recommend going the lacrosse ball route if you're not already comfortable with foam rolling, because it is a process to get used to it.
It hurts.
And when you're foam rolling, you never want it to be comfortable, but you don't want it to be painful. If it starts to become painful, then you should probably stop and readjust yourself. It's never supposed to be excruciatingly painful, but it will be uncomfortable. And that's something when talking to a lot of my athletes and trying to get them to understand the difference between discomfort and pain, because there is a difference. Pain.
I think something also to note is, like, if you feel like we're looking for discomfort in the muscle. If you start feeling things around like your ligaments or your tendons and stuff, maybe we need to make an adjustment.
Using the ball can feel a little bit more intense. My favorite thing to do with massage balls is both hip flexor releases and what's the muscle I'm thinking of? The one on the side of your leg.
Vastus lateralis?
No. The
adductors?
It is.
Or your IT band.
Your IT band. So,
all of that sucks.
Yeah, it's not great, but my personal recommendation, if you are using this massage ball, is, and we talk about just releasing muscle tension, is you're taking the massage ball and you're basically, let's see if I can stand up. hold on. Well, okay. So you'll find it. There's like a little pocket right here where you can really feel that psoas muscle. Stick in the massage ball, boom, right in that pocket, and essentially you're just lying on the floor and just letting it sit there, like we talk about. Because chances are, when we talked about that muscular imbalance, you're gonna have a knot in your iliopsoas area, as most people do. The other one again is that IT band release. So, hold on. So typically, like, it varies, but a general idea of where it would be, if I can get it on camera, is like right where like a pant pocket would be. So like right there, and you just want to sit on it, move it around a little bit. It's not going to feel pleasant unless this is something that you've already done, but most people do have some kind of knot already sitting there. But when we talk about hip mobility and hip flexibility, those are probably my two favorite massage ball releases to kind of get into those areas. But yeah, like I at a certain point just stopped using a foam roller, and I just started using a massage ball for every part of the muscle, because I just find it can get in deeper and it can get a little bit more specific. But that's something you need to kind of gradually step up to.
If you're really hardcore, use a golf ball.
Yeah.
Do we have anything more do you want to add for SMR?
Not really. I mean, SMR you can do on basically every part of your body. Like the kind of approach that I like to do is, again, starting at the feet. So I like to take the massage ball and I like to actually roll out the bottoms of my feet. So starting at the heel and just kind of rolling it out, and then making sure I'm getting the cross-sectional too. I'm rocking the boat, rolling at the bottom of my feet, and then I usually start at my calves, roll from my ankle to the bottom of my knee, get into my hamstrings. So again, roll from top of the knee to the glutes. Depending on how I'm feeling that day, I'll maybe substitute the massage ball for a foam roller to get my glutes, because I feel like because they are such a large muscle, I feel as though it's more efficient to just use something a little bit bigger, because it's kind of a pain to get every part of the glute with a massage ball, especially if you do have large glutes. And then, yeah, flipping over, I like to get another thing, like if you experience shin splints, which are, to put them simply, are basically like little tiny microfractures along your tibia, which again, your fascia is going to be responsible for some of that. Foam rolling your shins is probably the best way to relieve tension. It's unfortunate because, so obviously, when I was a sprinter, shin splints were a very common occurrence. It happens a lot, and I never had a foam roller my entire track and field career. I didn't even get a foam roller until I started training. So take it from me, if you've got shin splints, you want to be foam rolling. It's going to make your life so much easier. But yeah, any part of the body, I like to flip over. I like to do the quad thing, where I just take my ankle and I just kind of flex and extend my hamstring, and that you really will feel it, especially if you are on a knot. I think that's probably the most effective place to do it, just because it is such a large muscle, and especially when you are using the massage ball and it really gets deep in there. And then, yeah, you can roll out your lower back, go up, you can get your triceps, even your, this one sucks for me because, like I said, I have a very weak serratus, so just doing this is not fun for me. I'd never enjoy it, but it is something that you should always be doing, especially addressing those weak muscles with the massage ball or the foam roller. But yeah, any muscle you have, you can roll out, you can sit on the massage ball. So performing those SMR techniques are going to not necessarily increase performance, but they are going to rapidly increase recovery.
I think something I wanted to mention there is, when we look at foam rolling, like, it does, like, I guess this is the nerd stuff, but in regards to, like, its actual, like, specific what it does to the tissue and stuff like that, the reason it works is, well, one, as we did with, our dynamic and our static stretching, we're modifying that neural tone. So basically, we're calming the muscle down, letting the little muscle spindles know, like, hey, this is fine, let's loosen up a little bit. We have, by, physically moving the tissue and the fascia around, we're shifting water in and out. We're shifting in a bunch of different other fluids as well. trying to basically shift nutrients in and out, remove waste, stuff like that. That also helps with recovery. And as Matt said, we're fixing those like knots, those contractile properties of the tissue. And I guess like the last thing I wanted to leave for that was like use SMR where you see fit, but remember it's probably not the biggest part of your warm up or your cool down equation. It might help with those like physical sensations of pain, but if you're trying to like if you feel like your warm up's way too long or this or that, I would maybe chop it off because your actual movement prep and your like dynamic and your activation drills are probably a little bit more important.
Yeah, my like I guess when I recommend SMR, the ideal time to do is obviously if you want to do it post workout you can, but it's honestly beneficial to do on your off day because especially when you are going to be experiencing DOMS, which is that delayed onset muscle soreness that everyone experiences. You work out, you do squats the day before, the next day your legs are sore. That's DOMS. So when you are experiencing that, especially when it is rather aggressive and you're not having a good time, foam rolling that out is going to be the ideal and most beneficial time to do it. Honestly, I have nothing against doing like SMR like every day. Like if that's something that you want to do, like because it's something that's so easy to do. Like if you're just in your living room watching TV, just hop on the floor, pull out a foam roller, and just go to town on those muscles. It's something that you can't really overdo it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
There's really no reason to not do it.
I mean, like all of the off day stuff that we're talking about, it's so low intensity. We're essentially just moving our joints, adjusting tissue and stuff to help recovery. If you ever feel like you feel even worse, then you've probably just overdone it to a certain extent,
Yeah.
or you're actually hurt and you should probably go speak to a physio and get that fixed out.
Like it is possible to also bruise yourself while doing foam rolling as well. So just making sure that you are working within not that comfort level, but you're uncomfortable, but you're not like in pain. If you're in pain, then I don't recommend continuing to pain because that goes against the natural human response. If something hurts, you stop doing it and you address why it hurts instead of just barreling down because you think you're supposed to do it.
Yeah, don't be like me and be broken all the time.
Yeah. So that basically covers everything that we want to be kind of doing after we've exercised, but your recovery does not stop after you do your cool down. Recovery is something that's going to it's basically until your next workout essentially. So that includes off day, that includes night of, morning after, all that stuff. So I want to go over some kind of things that we can talk about that you can fit into your off day, just normal schedule. The first thing I want to talk about here that I really believe in is contrast showers. Essentially what these are, or what the purpose of this is, changing your body temperature from hot to cold over and over and over again. And the main aim of the contrast shower is to force your tissues to adapt to a sudden change in temperature. And this is highly stimulating because it's going to require a lot of metabolic and circulatory action. Now, like I talked a little bit before, contrasting temperatures are going to increase circulation by causing your heart to send blood just rushing to your vital organs. Now, over this time, this is going to force your circulatory system to become more efficient, more adaptable. And one of the most immediate benefits of contrast showers is going to be preventing that exercise-related injuries like DOMS, that delayed onset muscle soreness. So if you are feeling rather sore after a workout or the day after a workout, I highly recommend doing contrast showers for this reason. Now, because of this, contrast shower therapy is often used by like elite athletes, but that doesn't mean anybody can like. Contrast showers are so easy. You shower, everyone showers. At least I should hope they do. But working in contrast showers into your normal showering routine is as simple as just turning the knob on your shower. So
it just kind of sucks sometimes.
Yeah. So exposure to cold water is going to help reduce inflammation and injury by restricting blood flow to the area. So high and low temperatures can have a major impact on the amount of blood flow to our tissues, to our muscles, but kind of at the opposite extremes. So cold temperatures are going to cause blood vessels to shrink or tighten up. It's going to reduce blood flow and therefore reduce inflammation. That's what is called vasoconstriction. That's going to take our blood vessels and they are going to shrink. Heat, on the other hand, is going to cause what I talked about before, is vasodilation. So our blood vessels are going to widen up. What that's going to do is it's going to allow more blood to flow to those affected tissues and limbs and muscles and whatnot, which obviously blood's flowing, more oxygen, and everything that our blood carries, so those nutrients that we need for muscle recovery. Now, scientists have shown that switching between hot and cold water provides a substantial boost in your immune system as well. So basically, contrasting in temperature increases the number of immune system cells in your bodies, including an important type of white blood cell called monocytes. Now, contrast showers are great because they're super convenient. You can just do them as part of your normal everyday routine. Now, this philosophy of hot and cold also applies to ice baths, and I'm sure you've probably heard of elite athletes just dunking themselves into an ice bath and then hopping in a warm shower. It's the exact same principle being applied here. I just think contrast showers are easier and a little bit more comfortable because not everyone wants to jump into an ice bath or has the time to just jump into an ice bath. Like, essentially, how you want contrast showers to work is working on a 3-to-1 ratio. So that's going to be 3 minutes of hot water and then 1 minute of cold water, and then you're going to repeat that 6 to 8 times, however long you're taking that shower. And then you want to end on a cold water cycle. So it's just 3 minutes hot, swap it over to cold. It's going to suck probably, but studies have shown that obviously there's the exercise recovery component of it, but there's also a mental recovery of it. They say it can reduce depression. Honestly, when I take even just a regular cold shower, I do feel much better coming out of that shower, both physically and mentally, than if I were to take a hot one. But yeah, if you want something that's going to be easy to do and that's going to significantly improve your recovery abilities, contrast showers are definitely the way to go. If you really want to, you can try ice baths. Again, submersing yourself in that icy cold water and then jumping into something warm. That's going to give you that vasoconstriction, that vasodilation. Now, we talk about active recovery.
I wanted to kind of put like a little summary on I guess our ice baths or using temperature manipulation for recovery.
Sure.
Essentially, we're playing around with the ratio of the blood vessels being dilated and constricted to kind of either get some immune system adaptation, or for the most part just play around with when the nutrients are being shot in into certain locations and when they're being held back.
Yeah,
I guess that's the overall summary of like the theory behind it.
Pretty much. So one of the best forms of active recovery, so that's essentially just similar to our dynamic warm-up where we're warming up through movement. Active recovery is going to be recovering through movement, and one of the best ways and easiest ways to do that is just walking. We all do it. It's our primary form of locomotion. By simply walking for like 20 to 40 minutes, we can increase circulation, lubricate the muscles, and actually restore and maintain a proper gait pattern. So obviously super beneficial for runners after your run, after your workout, go for a walk. But walking is going to do a little bit of different things for different people, but in terms of active recovery, walking is going to be one of the best and easiest ways to recover. And then just some other ways you can active recover is going to be yoga. I've done yoga as a recovery method a few times, and it's worked for me. Personally, yoga is not really my thing, but as a recovery, it's pretty good. I've always had good experience with it. Swimming as well is going to be great because it is that low impact activity where you're just moving your body around in the water. Something you can also do, it's not really active recovery, but it's massage therapy. So if you really do feel like you need it, and this is something that a lot of high level athletes will have access to, is massage therapy. Obviously having a professional go over your muscles and do basically everything we've talked about up until this point, but you're just having having somebody do it to you is going to be not the most, yeah, I would say the most efficient method of
It
doing
just
that,
turns from self myofascial release to just
to just
myofascial release,
somebody doing myofascial release on you.
pretty much.
Yeah. Um, so that's kind of all the different active and passive recovery techniques when it comes to off day stuff. Now, stuff that we've kind of already talked about on this podcast, you can go back and you can watch the episodes about that. The first thing I want to talk about is sleep. Uh, Obviously, sleep serves as our main recovery phase that our body goes through every day. When we go into those deeper stages of sleep, our muscles are going to see an increase in blood flow, which is obviously going to bring oxygen and nutrients, all the stuff that our muscles need to recover and regenerate muscle cells and bring it just straight to the muscle. That's what happens when we sleep. Hormones are going to play a huge role too. So when the body enters its deep sleep stage, known as REM sleep, non-REM sleep. So that's going to be that stage 3, in between stage 3 and stage 4. If you want to learn more about that, you can go watch our sleep and performance podcast. Are you getting enough sleep? It was pretty good information. But no, you're going to be ending up in that stage 3 non-REM sleep. The pituitary glands are going to release growth hormones that are going to stimulate muscle repair and growth. And now when the body doesn't get enough rest, the secretion of those hormones actually declines, and it becomes harder for your body to recover from injuries. So it's really, really important that if you are really trying to recover, you're making sure you're getting the adequate amount of sleep to allow your body to enter that recovery phase and do everything that it needs to do to make sure your body is getting everything it needs to. Also, when we talk about hormones, prolactin, which is going to help regulate inflammation, it's also released while sleeping. And yeah, so similar to sleep deprivation, if you don't get enough sleep, you're actually more likely to experience inflammation in the body, which is going to make injury recovery more difficult, and it's going to put you at further risk of injury. So we talked about a little bit before about who needs however much sleep. As a teenage athlete, so anywhere between, I'd say, the ages of 14 to 18, you want to be looking at, for obviously all this ideal recovery to take place, we're looking at 10 to 14 hours of sleep a night, which I know is not doable for the majority of people. But if we really, really, really want to maximize that recovery phase, we're looking at 10 to 14 hours of sleep a night, where all of this is going to take place. Moving on to our last and sort of final point here, we talk about things that you can do in the off day and just every day to make sure your recovery is on point, is nutrition. So the previous 2 episodes have been talking about nutrition for performance, nutrition for recovery. So if you want, again, more detail on that, go watch those. But the general gist of recovery nutrition is what you want to be replenishing after you've exercised. So in this case, it's going to be those carbohydrate stores that we use to fuel our muscles. So making sure that, so when we work out, we're using those carbohydrates, we're using that glucose is being converted to glycogen, which is what our body's using for fuel. So making sure that when we've all used that all up, because like we talked about in that episode, when people talk about they're hitting a wall, that's a common term used with marathon runners usually. When you hit that wall, it feels like you can't go any further. That's when all of your carbohydrate stores have essentially been used up. So we want to make sure after we've hit that wall, we're replenishing everything that we just used, because we don't want to be in that low carb state going into the next workout. We also want to be able to ingest enough protein that's going to help promote muscle repair and muscle growth. So when we talked about protein synthesis and the muscle full effect, that ideal amount of protein that you need to make sure you're getting that muscle growth, as well as the inhibiting protein breakdown, all that stuff. So making sure that we're getting that protein post-workout to make sure our muscles are repairing and growing, because that's really what it's all about. And then the very last thing I want to touch on here is just hydration. So when we work out, we sweat, water comes out of our pores, and obviously it's being used for other physiological purposes there, but for the most part, we want to be able to replenish all the water that we just sweat out because our body needs water. It's majority water, right? So water and hydration is something that our body desperately needs, and when we excrete water, we need to replace water. So making sure we're constantly staying hydrated and constantly also restoring those electrolytes. So that's when recovery drinks such as Gatorade, Powerade, what other recovery drinks are there? Those are the only two that I know. I feel like there's other ones, but
even just like dextrose or like glucose powder. I'm not so sure about that. I think that's just straight carbohydrate, but it might be on like a technicality. It might be,
okay.
But those are pretty much the main ones. I think if we even mentioned more, people would just be like, okay, Gatorade and Powerade.
Yeah, but I mean that's
Yeah.
and when we talk about like when you should be using Gatorade and those kind of recovery drinks, they are recovery drinks. It's post workout. It's to replenish everything that you've lost. And typically they're formulated so they're going to include those carbohydrates. They're going to include those electrolytes. The water that you need is all going to be jam packed into those recovery drinks, and that's why I still like Gatorade is great if you're using it for recovery. If you're just using it to drink, then you're getting stuff that you don't really need. So stay away from just drinking Gatorade normally. Use Gatorade as a recovery beverage. It's going to be good for you. But yeah, that's basically all I've got personally on recovery. David, do you have anything else to add before we wrap it up here?
Honestly, no. For once, I'm trying to think of the perspective of the athlete overall.
Right.
I guess we mentioned earlier that we are going to have like our own little. We're going to have like a little document. Anybody who's listening can look at, or who's watching later on can take a look at, in regards to specific movements for like SMR, movement prep, muscle activation. I guess we could also toss in some little guidelines for recovery as well on there.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what ends up going up, and we'll probably toss that in the description of the YouTube clips or full episode that we eventually release.
Cool. All right. So with that, I think we're gonna wrap it up here.
Last thing.
Last
thing. This episode will in the future will be brought to you by Mammoth Mug. I'm very much determined for the sponsorship. It's gonna happen.
David is trying to get us a Mammoth Mug sponsorship, and if you want to help us achieve said sponsorship, make sure you are following, you are subscribing. Obviously,
you're tagging Mammoth Mug everywhere.
The bigger this channel grows, the more legitimacy and weight behind our name we have, the more likely that brands like Mammoth Mug are gonna want to come on and give us sponsorships. But
and then we get Mammoth Mug giveaways for everybody, and everybody wins.
Yeah, so it's a win-win for everybody. We get revenue, you get free Mammoth Mugs.
Exactly. This will end with us getting a Mammoth Mug sponsorship or a cease and desist letter for myself, but we'll see what happens.
We'll go from there. But yeah, as always, like, subscribe. If you have any questions at all, either drop them down in the comments below or shoot us a message at either myself or David at our socials. All of that's going to be linked, and we can kind of just clarify anything you need to be cleared up for you. Obviously, moving forward, I'm chopping segments of these into highlights, so if you missed something and you don't want to scrub back through the whole episode again, I will be putting up highlights for pretty much every major topic we've covered today, so keep an eye out for those. But yeah, that's about it. That's all we got for today. So
later everybody.
See you guys in the next one.